Well, good morning, everyone out there in webinar land. Thank you so much for joining us. It's Wednesday, October 7th. It's a gorgeous sunny morning here in Richmond, Virginia, and I hope it's just as pleasant wherever you are. I hope you're working smarter and not harder and maybe enjoying this program from your back porch or maybe a hammock somewhere. My name is Kevin Wilson. I'm excited to be hosting this conversation. Today we're going to be focusing on business logistics and the impacts of climate change, something that feels increasingly relevant if you're paying any attention to the headlines between a record-setting hurricane season, wildfires in the West, and highest recorded temperature in Death Valley this year. It's hard to escape some of these headlines. And we know that in order to operate, successful businesses, in order to have vibrant communities, we're going to have to adjust to the changing climate reality. Before I introduce our panel, and before we dive into that conversation, just a few housekeeping reminders. We are happy to answer any of your burning questions live and on the air today. Please submit those through the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. Try to avoid the chat function. We record these programs so that folks can view them or review them later at a later time. And the chat function doesn't play very nicely with those recordings. For anyone who does want to review this later, please go to dominionpayroll.com and hit the COVID-19 resource button in the green bar at the top of the homepage. You'll be directed to our upcoming webinar schedule and recordings of all of our past schedules, or past webinars rather. We also have a whole host of resources to help you navigate and run your business during these challenging times. All right, so without further ado, it is really a great pleasure to welcome our panel today. Joining me, I have Guenter Kryszon, the Executive Underwriting Officer for Global Property at Markel, 15 years in the insurance industry, and he now leads Markel's corporate initiatives around capacity growth and climate change. Guenter, it's so good to have you on today.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, and hello, everyone, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk through climate change and just what our organization is currently evaluating and more broadly what the industry is currently grappling with as it relates to climate change, because I think you mentioned the burning comment or burning questions. That's certainly been a hot topic, no pun or maybe pun intended, of what we're seeing happening over on the West Coast. And certainly as we grapple with this, not only as an insurance company and reinsurance company, but also looking at how we deal with this from an economic standpoint and building resiliency. I think all that really comes into play as we deal with climate change. And so just maybe broadening a little bit of what you touched on, Kevin, in terms of Markel, maybe a little bit additional backdrop on Markel. So Markel was founded in 1930, so we're 90 years young, and we're based here in Richmond, Virginia, so hometown company, and we operate within the insurance, the reinsurance, and our investment operations, and we're ranked right now about 335 on the Fortune 500 list, with overall revenues of about a little over $9 billion. And then my role is I oversee our insurance and reinsurance operations on the global property side. So really tasked with looking at the underwriting guidelines, guardrails. You mentioned climate change, so I focus a lot on climate change and how our organization is really assessing that risk and then working with clients to better understand that overall risk from a climate change perspective.
Great, thank you for filling in the bio a little bit and telling us about Markel. We appreciate that and excited to dig in on your perspective on this topic. But before we do that, I want to turn to our second guest, Dawn Oleksy. Sorry. Dawn is the Climate Action Program and Operations Supervisor for the City of Richmond. 10 plus years working in environmental sustainability. And I know that City of Richmond is rolling out between the Richmond 300 program and so many of these sustainability efforts. So it's an exciting time to have you on the program and talk about the ways in which municipalities interact with private businesses and how our communities are preparing for the coming years and decades. Dawn, thank you for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. I've been with local government for the past 10 years, but prior to that, I have another 10 plus years in environmental consulting and working with the private sector. So, and an MBA to understand that business connection. So I'm really happy to be here, happy to answer any questions. And Richmond is rolling out our climate action planning process right now. So it's great timing to get more stakeholders involved in this conversation. We'll be focusing on our plan is called RVA Green 2050, and it's an equity-based climate action, adaptation, and resilience planning effort with a focus on improved quality of life. So it's all about balancing risk and economic development and incorporating all of those priorities, community priorities from Richmond 300.
Awesome. That is great. And as I said, I really appreciate the both of you taking the time to be here. Guenter, I want to turn to you. Recently I was reading a fairly large piece that was in the New York Times. And one of the reasons, frankly, that I reached out to you was the role that insurance seems to be playing in the handling of wildfires in California and Oregon. And it was honestly a perspective that I had never really considered. If there are areas that are more susceptible, whether it is wildfires or tornadoes or flooding, insurance is going to play a pretty big role in whether people can even have properties there. Could you tell us a little bit about how does the insurance industry look at these changing risk factors, and maybe just sort of elaborate a little bit more on what you're seeing sort of boots on the ground out there in the U.S. and the world?
Sure. If you look at, and I'll focus predominantly on California, because this year you've seen about, and we're still climbing every single day, we've got about 4 million acres within the state of California, which is 4% of the overall land area within California that has succumbed to wildfires this year. And so you can argue that there's certain events that have triggered that. We've had, over the past several years, you've had some electricity impacts, or from PG&E in terms of some of the causes or origins of some of those wildfires that occurred, or what we've seen on some of the lightning strikes that have generated some of the wildfires this year. And certainly that is promulgated the overall, if you look at it from a fuel loading standpoint, the overall fuel load that is accumulated over the past several years within the state of California to create what have been some fairly sizable wildfire losses over 2018, 2019, and what we see now within 2020, just in terms of the magnitude and just the frequency with which we're seeing that's been directly influenced with climate change. You mentioned in terms of the heat that we saw within California. They had some areas within and right outside of LA where they were hitting 120-degree days, which is pretty much unprecedented in the past. And so you've had longer, drier seasons. You've had which is dried out and create a more fuel load. And then you topple that with some of the origins that we've seen from the wildfires that has certainly impacted and contributed to what we're seeing. So the direct benefits, or I should say the direct impacts of what we're seeing from climate change is really playing into what we're seeing from a wildfire perspective. The challenge has been really being able to better manage what we see from a growth standpoint within California. So if you look at the amount of acreage that is actually being converted into housing for people to live in within the state of California, 4,000 acres, which is a pretty significant amount, is being converted every day into usable space, whether it be industrial properties, whether it be into homeowners or residential areas. And they're starting to butt up to what they call the wildland urban interface and intermix. So think of the interface abutting directly up to the wildfire zone, and the intermix being a home that's surrounded by trees and forest, et cetera. So that growth that we're seeing within that wildland urban interface is increasing at a rate that's greater than what we've seen in the past. And as the population continues to shift closer to that wildland urban interface, we're starting to see the magnitude of those losses going forward. You interject all these losses that we've seen, what we are challenged with as a society, and being able to just manage land use and ultimately make sure that everyone has a place to live, or make sure that we're able to support some of the growth, that's creating unique challenges to then better manage aggregation risk. So if I look at it from an insurance and a reinsurance perspective, the magnitude of these losses has been fairly sizable, and being able to manage balance sheets against that, and to be able to support the continued growth in that area is continuing to be a challenge because of the frequency that we're seeing right now. So I think it's a matter of managing the growth, but then also looking at building resiliency, which I'll speak to in a little bit.
Yeah, great. Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there. Dawn, I want to bring you in on the conversation. You from sort of a municipal standpoint, are looking at, communities, infrastructure, housing, entertainment, public, the whole mix. And I'm curious, what are some of the concerns that are top of mind for you? Obviously, it'd be great if there were a silver bullet to solve these problems, and we'd just be like, well, let's have more parks, and then we'd be, done. Like, hey, you see more trees, we're good. Unfortunately, that's not the reality. So I'm sort of curious, as you approach, Richmond's climate action plan, you look at municipalities across the U.S., what's the right balance, and what are some of the top concerns between sort of economic engine that grows and also, protecting and making it so that it is sustainable, not just in 2021 or 2022, but 21.
Right. Absolutely. Well, this RVA Green 2050 is a net zero goal to become carbon neutral by 2050. And so we're in the process, actually, we're wrapping up our net zero modeling project now. And, the climate action measures that are being developed are things like building benchmarking and electric vehicle infrastructure, electric fleets, decarbonization, and public transit. And then there's all of the resilience side of the house, which is the green infrastructure and wastewater management and all of those good things. So from a climate action, management perspective, there's a lot, the things that we have control over, we are working on now. We are benchmarking our buildings. We are retrofitting and looking for all the grant opportunities to develop our own electric fleet and charging systems. But going out into the community and getting the business sector to jump on board is the challenge, because we have no control over that. So trying to link long-term planning, I feel like that's my goal. My mission is to get folks to understand the co-benefits of sustainable thinking and their own strategic planning. They're completely aligned. Long-term sustainability is strategic planning. And so the more I can educate and align all of these priorities, I think the stronger and more successful we'll be as a community.
I think that term co-benefits really jumped out at me. That's a good way through that door to recognize that it's not necessarily one hand pushing the other, but it's something that we can do together. You mentioned refurbishing buildings and looking at some of these things that folks can do, here and now. I'm curious, Guenter, as you look across sort of the portfolio of folks that you insure and reinsure, are you seeing folks that are, let me back up a sec. I know that when I say insure my house, I get a little bit of a discount if I have smoke alarms and deadbolt locks. Practical thing that says, hey, the insurance company probably won't have to pay out as much because we'll be aware. When you look across, sort of the whole sector, are there benefits to these things, in terms of cost to, business operators to refurbish buildings or to put in stormwater management? Are you seeing some of these things come up in the actual engineering of the spaces where people are doing business? And does that have an impact in the industry where you operate?
Absolutely. And if I look at from Markel's portfolio today, we insure everything from homeowners all the way to commercial properties. And so a vast array of different assets that we insure and ultimately reinsure as well too. And when I look at just the impacts that we see from building resilience, which is kind of where I think your question is trying to drive towards, there's absolutely a benefit for building resilience. And if you look at the designs that are out there today and that have been in place really post Hurricane Andrew in '92 in Florida, and then that's been expanded through the International Building Code and the American Society of Civil Engineers that has really promulgated some of the building resiliency to resist from hurricanes, has been in place and has constantly been enhanced over the past several years. And there's a direct correlation that you can see homes that were engineered and built to those specific codes and homes that weren't. And it's very much of a stark contrast. Personally, being down and seeing some of the events after a hurricane from buildings, either commercial or residential, that were designed adequately to resist the effects of windstorm, as an example, certainly do perform better. And there is a corresponding level of analysis that goes into how we ultimately would charge for that individual risk based upon individual characteristics. You can then translate that to what I think everyone's trying to wrap their minds around today, which is around the wildfire risk out in California. And you're saying to yourself, can I really prevent the house from burning? And the Wildland Urban Interface, they actually released a building code several years ago that does promulgate some of that design, very similar to what we saw from a hurricane standpoint. So it's sealing of eaves. If you actually look at the wildfire embers, which is the majority of how the wildfire spreads, 85 to 90% of the spread of wildfire is contributed, not just because of the fire, it's the winds coupled with the burning embers that ultimately spread to these homes that get sucked up into these eaves because you have the natural ventilation. You think about, you go outside, look at your house today, you'll see your natural eave ventilation there. That just creates an updraft for these embers to get sucked into people's houses. So there are ways to seal those. There's defensible space around your perimeter of your either commercial building or your house to help mitigate the impacts from wildfire. So you can translate that into multiple different things. You can talk about that with flood and some of the mitigation opportunities. You go walk down in Shockoe Bottom and you see those massive floodgates. Certainly that deters and mitigates the impacts of flood to certain areas of our city, and you take that out within the U.S. So you can certainly design buildings, and there is a tangible benefit, because the last thing we all want to have to do is to be without a home for a period of time while it's being rebuilt, and certainly the cost escalation that comes with that. So I think absolutely from a resiliency standpoint, and that's something that we talk to our clients about, and we're constantly evaluating, and that does factor itself into how we look at risk and how we view risk. And so as we as a society continue to look at not just building resiliency, but to look at it in the context of climate change, these are actions that we need to be taking forward.
Yeah, I thank you for that. Dawn, as you look at Richmond, Virginia's plan, here we are located in Central Virginia. Hopefully my house here in Henrico County is never beachfront property, but there are, we know that in the coming 10, 20, 30 years, there are going to be changes to our coastlines, to how arid certain areas are and all of that. And I'm curious, as you are developing Richmond's 2050 plan and looking, into the future, obviously you don't have a crystal ball and can't predict with certainty. But, knowing that 90 miles down the road, Hampton Roads is going to be adversely impacted, in terms of your planning, how much are you considering the movement of people and some of the resources that are going to have to come into play, with a growing city that we have?
Absolutely. So there is a tool that it's very telling on our website. If you go to rvagreen2050.com and then look for the climate equity tool, you can put in it's a GIS based map, and you can put in all kinds of indicators. And let me make sure I have that right, rvagreen2050.com, and then you'll see a climate equity lens mapping system, and you put in your address, and it has all kinds of factors from the social vulnerabilities and demographics. It's down to the census tract. It shows 20, I forget the margins, but future storms and flooding. and all of those impacts, urban heat island. It also has the structural racism and redlining history, the history of the interstate and what that did to the communities. So you can see a little bit of that, the impacts that have gone on historically and that are just going to get worse as time goes on. So that's one interesting tool we have. But then obviously, yes, in terms of incoming populations, that is something that we have to be considering all the time. Like you said, Hampton Roads, that reverse highway stops at James City County, which is, just an hour from Richmond. So as people are leaving Hampton Roads, we're kind of the next city up. So
Yeah.
You're right.
So Dawn, I want to stay with you for a sec. As you're developing this plan, I'm really curious, what are some of the practical elements? Is it more trees in these urban heat islands? Is it, I don't expect the full laundry list, because I know that it's, I don't know that we have the time in the hour to go through each of them, but what are some of the top items that, that Richmond and other municipalities are doing around the country?
Well, right now, the biggest bang for the buck is our energy footprint. So the more renewables we're using, the more electrification, decarbonization is going to get us there. Transportation is huge in Virginia. That's where a ton of emissions come from. And of course, the energy sources. So that's the big focus. The waste is actually a pretty small piece of the puzzle, but it's something that connects everyone to each other. You can see the trash, you can see the recycling, you can understand what a circular economy is. We have the visuals of the plastics in the ocean. So that's, even though the carbon impacts of that aren't quite as big as the energy and transportation emissions, it's an important part of the conversation. So in terms of what people can be doing now, especially businesses, it's understanding their impacts. Everyone has a role to play in this. So, every piece of what we're doing is touching every piece of society, from infrastructure to economic development, jobs creation, health and welfare. And the more the businesses can start prioritizing their climate commitments, the greater the ROI will be. Get it in there from the beginning, and the more successful their long-term plans will be.
Absolutely. I know that in the before time, when we were in our offices every day, Dominion Payroll, we spent a lot of time looking at everything from how can we convert folks to digital documentation of everything, down to can we get rid of the coffee stirrers at the coffee pot, and it was really a sort of a holistic analysis of the things that we could do to sort of lessen that impact. Guenter, I want to turn to you, and not in a dark and foreboding way, but there are changes that are happening, and frankly, ensuring a piece of coastline that's going to be underwater probably is not in Markel's best interest long term. As you look out over the coming century, are there spaces where the insurance industry, or really I'm just asking you to speak on your behalf, might say, hey, what, that part of the country is just, it's not worth us carrying a policy there? Or is it more, hey, let's figure out solutions and work with the communities so that we can mitigate these risk factors and continue to operate, or a bit of both? What do you see from that perspective?
It's a challenging question, in that the easy answer is to say we're not going to write any more risk, and let's just stay on the topic of California. We're not going to write any more risk within the state of California, because the whole state is potentially susceptible, and thereby what you're seeing today happen is many carriers are pulling out of the state of California and not providing coverage, and a lot of that property that was insured within the standard market, or even the non-standard market, is making its way to the fair plan within California, which is creating a lot of challenges today for people to be able to even keep the affordability on their home. So I think it's not a full, let's pull out of a particular state, or we're not going to insure a particular coastline, but it's working with communities to better understand the resilience of how these buildings are being constructed, the limitations on building in certain areas. If you actually look at today, 13% of the population, the US population, lives within a known 100-year flood zone. And so when these floods occur, people are rebuilding back in these flood zones only to have these floods occur again. That's going directly to taxpayers. It's going to the federal the federal flood plan today that's in place, and certainly the sustainability that is in question. You then translate that to what we see over the next 25 years in terms of population growth, and they're forecasting another 16% are going to reside within a 100-year flood zone. So if you think about it from a community standpoint, it's the resiliency of the community, not allowing areas to be rebuilt, because at some point in time it becomes uninsurable. And that's where I think there has to be this partnership between what we see on the insurance, reinsurance side, ultimately communities building resiliency, I think, is a big component of that as well too. And then making sure that we're all collectively working together, because the concerns are real. We're seeing the impacts of it play out. We look today and we're up to 25 named storms within the Atlantic, which is pretty close for those keeping track. We're pretty close to the number we saw in 2005. So we're seeing the significance of it increase, and that's just coming year after year of what we've seen from a repetitive storm standpoint. Properties that are constantly being impacted, we either have to build in the resiliency component of it from a building code perspective, and then we need to look at, does it make sense to allow rebuilding in known areas where we're going to continually have to rebuild these particular homes or businesses.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and something that's worth highlighting is that private insurance sort of extends to the property line, and obviously municipalities carry insurance, but this is more than just a policy that pays out when something bad happens. I mean, there's taxpayer costs, there's a greater impact beyond just sort of dollars that move from one bank account to another here, and people have their lives disrupted. It does get to a point where, whether it's insurable or not, people start making choices, say, hey, I don't want to deal with my basement flooding every 3 years. Heading for higher ground. Dawn, sort of on that topic, from a municipal perspective, for the last, 100, 200 years, the interest of any local government is to attract and retain businesses and homeowners, and have that tax base that can contribute to, whether it's infrastructure or public education, or just nice amenities for a community. I'm curious, where are you seeing the public policy conversation around, this is how we can sustainably attract people and house them and have them in our community? Or, is there still sort of an older way of doing business where it's just the more the merrier, everybody in, we'll figure it out, and, we'll build the wings as the airplane's taking off. What's the state of that conversation that you're seeing at local government level?
Well, I'm not sure I understand exactly the question. So you're, in terms of, are we just kind of building and moving forward, or are we considering incoming population?
I guess my question is this: obviously, the Green 2050 plan, you're behind that and supporting it. Are you seeing resistance in other quarters of the government that say, hey, that's a nice to have rather than a need to have? Or are you seeing buy-in across saying this is critical and a critical function of what we're going to do as a local government?
That's a great question. So up until recently, all of this kind of long-term planning, there is a roadmap to climate sustainability that was written a few years ago. All of these kind of green initiatives up until now have been kind of, oh yeah, that's nice. How are we going to do that? Let's put some incentives in there for green building, but if businesses don't want to do it, they don't have to. What we've learned as professionals in the environmental sustainability field is that you have to educate on those co-benefits, and it has to be the priorities have to align, or you're not going to get that buy-in. And so that's why we're kind of, all of these cities across the country and the world even are changing the conversation and making sure that we are having that very, top down, bottom up conversation where everyone is involved. And so from a policy perspective, the local government council did pass the net zero resolution in June. And so this is something that everyone's behind. And we're integrating from the Richmond 300 to the, our water, long-term water management plans, to our incorporating envision policies, and then of course the state and federal government policies, aligning our planning with them. And just it's like this slow moving, evolving process, not just kind of coming up with our own personal dream, but really what is going to work and how can we draw all the stakeholders into this conversation so we make something that's actually going to be implemented and successful in the end.
Great. Guenter, I'm curious where, as an insurance company, obviously you guys interact with the regulations in each state. And, we've seen in California where, some insurers are pulling away from certain areas and just saying, hey, the risk is too much here. And the state comes in and says, you don't get to leave. We've got a population that's rebuilding houses. To take sort of a step back from that, what are some of the public policy things that, you would like to see out there in the world, whether it's a local, state, or federal level, that, what's a smart policy that would sort of help folks as we're navigating this changing landscape?
Yeah, the benefit that we're blessed with within the insurance industry is we get to talk to 50 different states and figure out the different nuances from state to state, because they certainly do vary quite considerably from each individual state. But that also does bring it does bring a level of ideation that comes with that in terms of working with some of the different state regulators in solving some of these tougher problems. And I think as you start to deal with some of these issues we're seeing, whether it's I think we've talked a lot about wildfire, but maybe change the conversation down to Florida and looking at what happened years ago when Andrew had occurred, and there was a flock of insurance companies that moved out of Florida over concerns of being able to just understand the exposure base, understand what's being done. I've talked a lot about building resiliency. Then the other component of it is leveraging analytics and data to not only inform, because we do leverage a lot of data and analytics and how we look at risk, but it's providing that to the governments, the local regulators. So from our perspective, the insurance regulators, the consumers themselves, to let them know what their exposure is, or give them more insight into their exposures, because there's a lot that we've done around the data analytics, talking with a lot of different companies out there. We use the acronym InsurTech, but that's just from an insurance company perspective, leveraging a lot of technology that's out there, bringing and marrying those two together, where they've been able to look at different solutions for clients. You hear the term parametric, which is based on a particular trigger that occurs that's maybe outside of the general indemnification that we look at, to then pay out for a particular loss. And so there's different things that we can work with regulators to do, and work with individual insureds and individual states to help them better understand the risk. And then ultimately, are there products that we can leverage on the heels of some of that technology that's rolling out? I've seen a couple within the industry today that, and as Markel, we've supported, that would look at snow removal as an example, where you have some municipalities today where they have a certain budget for snowfall based on what they've seen the impacts of climate change. We tend to focus on what's occurring, whether it's burning or the hurricanes that are occurring. But this particular company that we've partnered with is looking at, if your budget has exceeded a certain amount of snowfall in a particular year, and you set your budget at, let's just say, $1 million, and now it's $2 million to now remove that snow, you can hedge against that. And through our Nafila climate, we actually have a couple different offerings whereby we can provide some level of hedge against some of the impacts that we're seeing from the climate change. So there are things that can be done. It just looking at the level of ideation and working with clients to better inform what their risk is, and then also overlay some creative solutions to help bridge those two together.
Very interesting. Not to make light of changing snowfall patterns, but I will just say that my son, who turns 10 in a couple days, got a snowboard for Christmas last year, and the only thing we want to see is some snow this year. I did not get a chance to use that. Yeah. Dawn, I thought that Guenter brought up an interesting, just sort of an interesting insight, that the use of technology and analytics in determining, where impacts are going to be felt and figuring out, what is the risk. You can get fairly granular given the technology that we have that didn't exist 5, 10, 15 years ago. I'm wondering if you could comment on any of the technology that the city is using in terms of, I'm sure that there's both, boots on the ground survey results, but also I'm sure that there's some, very interesting tech that's coming to bear. Anything around that topic?
Well, so the GIS mapping is huge. We're doing a lot of that, looking at vulnerable populations and urban heat islands. There's an article in the New York Times a few weeks ago about Richmond and the heat island effect. All of that mapping that's coming out of our office is being used for COVID, vulnerabilities. So I would say that's the biggest one that we're using. I use Energy Cap software to understand our carbon footprint based on our energy usage. And that's really telling when, we have staff out there working on buildings, we have engineers building new buildings or trying to decide where to potentially offset buildings. And if we're looking at the carbon footprint and we're measuring those utility costs, it makes it a lot easier. So all of that benchmarking is important. And then with the net zero modeling that we're doing that with some consultants, but they are some highly technical resources that are looking at the source energy. So where Dominion is getting their power at which times of the day. Is it solar versus natural gas versus all the other sources? And if we were, what are the carbon emissions at these different times? And so if we were going to look at our building stock, are they office buildings versus residential versus industrial? What can we do to make the industrials more efficient? Is there combined heat and power? Is there, other ways of retrofitting equipment? And it's exciting to know that these technologies exist that can really help us make smarter decisions that kind of see into the future for us. Load shedding, all of these technical initiatives and measures that we can implement.
So I have a question for both of you. This does ask you to shake up your crystal ball a little bit, but as a kid, I was really enamored of Popular Science magazine, Discover, and there every so often there'd be an article about sort of the city of the future, whether it was flying cars or what have you. And I think a lot of us have this vision in our head of communities where I'm growing tomatoes on my roof next to my solar array, and I have rainwater recycling that's super efficient, and recycled asphalt that doubles as electric conduit to electric vehicles. I mean, all of these sort of fanciful things, and we see in fits and starts that some of these technologies are viable, but that fully integrated community of the future. I'm curious, and Dawn, let me stick with you, because I think this is probably something that you at least have a vision in your head of. How realistic is that sort of glorified utopian eco community, and recognizing that it's not likely to look like the pages of Popular Science magazine. But sort of what does that actual timeline look like? Will my kids grow up in those communities, um, or how far off are we?
So I think that it is exciting to think about. You look at the technology changes just in the past 10 to 20 years. It's just skyrocketing. And some of the things that we have, some of the measures we have in our plan that are being considered are biophilic cities, looking at actually seeing green infrastructure, autonomous vehicles, more bike lanes and walking lanes, and figuring out ways to get people from point A to B with zero emissions, the circular economy. So how are we reusing everything and the water? I definitely think that by 2050, these are all written into our modeling. So I think it's exciting to be thinking about and to be part of the conversation. LED streetlights are already going in. We're, like I said, the retrofitting buildings, being very creative about motors and drives, switching our fuels, the codes that are coming in. The mayor just announced 10 new green spaces, parks. The goal is to have everyone within just a few minutes walk of a green space. That's happening now. So I'm with you.
Yeah, that's great. Guenter, I'm curious, as from an insurance perspective, it's a motivating factor in where people, if it's 5,000 in this area and 2,500 in this area to insure my building, that's a pretty good incentive for me to reconsider these things. Do you see that as a pretty big push towards these green communities? And what do you think? What does 2050 look like from where you're sitting?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I certainly have those same fantasies in terms of what does that city of the future actually look like. And I thought at this point in time we'd all be riding around on hoverboards and flying in the air with our self-propelled cars. And to me, I think it's a matter of technology and scale, and then ultimately cost, and having to weigh all those benefits together is to say how do we then move this forward? Because I think in broad brushes of it, we are there in certain elements. I think Dawn touched on a couple of those individual points. You look at the state of California, they've said by 2035, all cars have to be electric. All new cars that are being sold have to be electric. And so they're certainly taking their first step towards moving in that direction. And then looking at the amount of renewable energy that they are going to be consuming. And there are some transition risks that are currently occurring today. And I think we're going to continue to see that throughout the next several years. And ultimately getting to a point where we do have a very minimal amount of carbon emissions. We're able to then, ideally from my standpoint, it would be great if we get to where the Paris Agreement has outlined it, to get to no more than 2 degrees Celsius temperature change in the overall heating that we're experiencing as an entire world. And so there are certain things we've got to do to get there. Some of which involve renewable energy, some of which involve managing our footprint. And you're starting to see, as a business owner, and I know that there's a fair amount of business owners on this call, but just thinking through, if you look at the New York Times today, JP Morgan just announced what they're going to be doing in terms of the overall investment side of it and who they're going to be investing in. I think while we're focused on the E of ESG, so environmental, social, and governance, and focusing on the climate change piece of it, there is the broader ESG overall view as to the investment dollars, where they're ultimately going within not only our industry, but throughout every single industry that's being invested in today. So those things have to be considered. There has to be a plan to enact that, and certainly renewable energy. We're working with our Same and Phil Climate Division to look at ways to support renewable energy and the growth of that renewable energy, because I do think that is very important when we think about the technology piece of it. Right now, the cost efficiencies aren't necessarily there, and the reliability is not necessarily there, so that we can de-lever ourselves from coal. And I don't think the answer is to say we're not going to insure coal plants today going forward. So there has to be a healthy transition, and I think leveraging technology will get us there, but we also have to have industry support. So insurance companies, to your point earlier around supporting people that are in the wildfire zones or right next to the coast, we've got to be able to then support and have ways to support some of that renewable growth, but the same token, work with industries to help delever our overall carbon emissions.
Really good point there. So, I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I know that we're getting close to noon, but I wanted to touch on one topic real quick, and the question of so-called greenwashing, where businesses maybe put a recycling bin out front, but they're spewing chemicals out the back. And Dawn, I think you might be able to speak to this a bit, with the incentivization of of the Green 2050 plan. How much of that is carrot and how much of that is stick? Really, it's sort of, how much do you say, hey, you don't get to just put change the color of your menu to a green color and be like, we're there, we've made it. What are those regulations starting to look like in the city of Richmond and from any of your colleagues around the country? Are we seeing regulations that are coming in and saying, hey, like, the bare minimum's not enough anymore, or is it still more self-directed?
At this time, I would say in Richmond especially, it's more self-directed. We are, like I said, we're in the middle of the net zero modeling. We're about to kick off the planning process. And from that planning process, we'll be developing the policies that are going to get us to our goal. So I think we've all seen the greenwashing, and we know that it's not the solution. The little Band-Aids are not it. We do have to understand the co-benefits and the long-term sustainability of planning for climate change. It's not something we really have a choice about anymore. So, I think folks are recognizing that we don't have a choice. So I'm with you. The policies are the next step. Incentives, grant opportunities, education right now is really the biggest piece of this, really getting folks to understand how climate change relates to them and their future. That's still a big leap.
Great. Guenter, is there anything you want to add to that? I'm not sure there's necessarily an insurance in on that.
But I do think Dawn makes a very key point there in the education component of it. I think it's hard. If we rewind the clock 30 years ago, there was, while people were talking about climate change, the action wasn't there. And now that we're firsthand experiencing what we were forecasting years ago to start to occur, and there's a lot of research that may have not been as sophisticated as it was 30 years ago as what it is today, and also leveraging some of the analytics and tools. I think that education piece of it is very important. And our environment is starting to change very rapidly, both what we see externally and whether it's the hurricanes, the wildfires, et cetera, but also what we're seeing from the investment side of it, from just being able to transact business. All of that is changing very rapidly. And it's no more the greenwashing where you put a bin out and say, yes, we're not using styrofoam cups anymore. This is more broad-based into how you're operating your business, what your impact is, your emissions impact, how you're ultimately investing your asset dollars, who you're ultimately supporting as a business. And all those things are starting to come into play, where the linking now of climate change is not just looking at whether or not I put a solar panel on my roof. It's much more integrated in how you transact your business. So unless we start to adapt to that, you're going to find companies are going to be adversely impacted by that, both physically, but also in the ability, whether it's to secure financing or the ability to even operate their business with some of their suppliers and customers. So all this, I think, has to continue to evolve, because it is moving at a much more rapid pace than what we have seen in the past. And educating, the education component of it, and educating people on the impacts of it and businesses on the impact of it, I think is a great point.
No, that's a great way to begin to wind down this conversation. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that the choices in front of business owners that want to be operating successfully in 10, 20, 30 years, now is the time to be considering these. The age-old quote of, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. If you didn't plant that tree 20 years ago, today is the day to start thinking about these things, and making, real impacts on the way that you operate your businesses. Well, guys, I really do appreciate, that was a really robust conversation. Before we wind down, I always love to give guests an opportunity to either call to action, or share, something that sort of gives you hope in the work that you're doing right now, in terms of getting out of bed every day. Dawn, I'll say that personally, I'm guilty of going a little too deep on the headlines and the 24-hour news cycle, and it's easy to find more despair than hope there. But honestly, I think that, sometimes I take a little comfort that it may be darkest before the dawn, and I think that there's a lot of reason to be excited about the next 10, 20 years and all of the changes for the positive that are coming. But if you wouldn't mind, tell our audience, where can they connect with RVA Green, but also what's something that's positive or hopeful that you've experienced in the last couple months as we're navigating all this?
Sure. So, I've just been with Richmond for the past 6 months. Prior to that, I was with James City County. So I went from a small rural tourist-centered, county to a state capital, a city. And there are different politics, different priorities. And I'm so encouraged by Richmond and what's going on behind the scenes. Really smart people creating really smart plans, looking at best practices from cities all over the country and all over the world, partnering. And this planning process, it's a 2-year climate action planning process. So right now I'm going to be overseeing 3 technical working groups with technical experts in the areas of waste, transportation, and buildings and energy. And then we have a couple other technical working groups that are focused on community priorities, the people-centered piece of this, and the environment, the natural environment. So as those kick off, those technical working groups that are taking Richmond 300 and the net zero modeling and coming up with this plan, we need as many folks to step in and be part of this process as possible. So I really want to urge everyone to go to rvagreen2050.com/participate if you want to see the different options. Our web designer did a great job of making it easy. We have a 1-minute sign up for emails, a 5-minute share the opportunity with a social media toolkit, 10 minutes to take a survey, 30 minutes to come meet with us, 1 hour to become an ambassador and go out and talk about this in the community. You can apply to be on a working group. And again, it goes on, but we would love to keep anyone involved in this conversation who's interested and willing.
Love it. So that's rvagreen2050.com. Go check it out, everybody. Guenter, I'm going to give you the last word here. As you manage and look across Markel's global property portfolio, there's certainly, you live with risk every day in the insurance industry. So there's maybe always cause for some concern, but as you consider climate change and the impact it's going to have on your company's bottom line and the communities where, we all live and work and play, do you see reason for hope? Do you see positive change happening out there?
Yeah, I would maybe harken back to, I'm fairly new to Richmond, so I spent the past 22 years living in Atlanta and then moving here to Richmond about 1.5 years ago with my family. And we took a stroll when we first moved here down by the waterfront and near downtown, and just looking at these giant walls and these giant gates that are sitting there, and not really understanding the history behind why are they there, and certainly doing a little bit more digging as we came up here to look for homes, understanding the impact in the James River and the flooding that had occurred, and so that overall awareness. And so when I think about the awareness side of it and ultimately what we see more broadly in the industry, it's having more awareness as to what ultimately those impacts are. So if we think about sustainability, I think it's the city of Norfolk that was not allowing any new buildings to occur within 100-year flood zones, and taking a pretty tough stance on new development that was at the disadvantage of some of the local contractors that wanted to develop and real estate developers that wanted to develop the land, and that was met with a lot of adversity. And so certainly tax dollars lost, but not sacrificing what could be future impacts for development fees. And so I think it's having that awareness, understanding what those impacts are. There's a lot of different resources available to better support that awareness piece of it, but just being more aware of, and as a community, being more aware of what our impacts are and how best to manage that. Building resiliency, understanding where you're physically located or where you may be buying assets in or supporting assets in.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. And to you both, I appreciate you taking the time today to be with us and share your perspective, your expertise. I found it absolutely fascinating. I know our audience has really gained a lot of insight here today. So Guenter, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And Dawn, it's been a real pleasure.
Oh, same. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Wonderful. All right, folks. Well, as we are wrapping up this installment of our Industry Spotlight and Business Topics webinar, I appreciate you joining us today. We are here every day at 11 for all your legislative needs, navigating PPP loans, FFCRA, you name it. We are here for you. Once again, just a big thank you to Guenter and Dawn for joining us today. Really awesome conversation around business logistics and the growing impact of climate change. I think if there's anything that I've learned over the last many months as we've been doing these shows, whether we're talking about COVID-19 or economic fallout or climate change as we did today, I keep coming back to the phrase that we're in this together and that we're better together. And I don't know that there's a topic where that rings more true. So I hope that you all enjoyed this conversation and got something out of it. Reminder to check out rvagreen2050.com if you're here in the Richmond area, see how you can engage with that. Before we wrap up, I would encourage everybody to go to dominionpayroll.com and check out the COVID-19 updates button there at the top of the page. You'll be able to see all of our previously recorded webinars. This one will be posted shortly. You can also access a ton of resources to help you run your business. Next week, a week from today, my colleague Leslie Bruno is going to be hosting her HR Matters webinar program and going to be doing a deep dive on COVID-19 and the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Just celebrated a big milestone. I think it's 25 years that it's been in force. I may be wrong on that as I'm thinking about it, but absolutely critical topic to consider as you run your business. And so please join us next Wednesday at 11 a.m. for that conversation. And please join us every day at 11 for all of our webinars. We appreciate you taking your time out of the day to be here with us. Wishing you all a happy Wednesday, be in good health, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Take care.